Little Lunch series and our first Friday. So we've made it through a week, just about. Thanks very much for everyone for all the support and great input this week. So my name's Norm Horton, and with Sarah Moynihan here, we're from Feral Arts and Arts Front, and we're the hosts for this first lot of arts Little Lunch Online. We're working and living on Cubby Cubby lands in the Sunshine Coast, and it's a real privilege to be here, and we encourage everyone to, as you speak, acknowledge whose country you're living and working on at the moment. So today's session is really exciting. It's a great conversation between Marinda Donnelly, I don't know what your position is now, Marinda, at basically the head of Black Dance, based in Brisbane, but national service organisation, and Josh Pether, who's a practicing artist who's living in Western Australia. But I'll let Marinda and Josh both introduce each other. We're going to spend about 15 or so minutes of Josh and Marinda in conversation about some practice things that Josh wants to share with us. Then we're going to have a chance for everyone to join that conversation, be part of that. And then at the end, we're going to invite Anne Dunn to say a few words about an idea that she's putting forward and working with us on about trying to share some resources between us and between artists. So thank you very much again for joining, and we might pass over to you, Marinda.
Thanks, Norm. Yama, and good morning, everyone. My name's Marinda Donnelly, and I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman, yarning to you all today from Turrbal and Yagara land. I'm the executive producer of Black Dance, and I'm joined today by little Billy. She has a lot to say, so we're just going to try and work with this situation as best as we can. But I'm delighted to be hosting a Q&A with an incredible artist, Joshua Pether. And Josh and I have been chatting a fair bit this week. And so Josh, might just get you to start by saying, who's your mob, where are you from, and what are you doing right now?
Okay. G'day everyone. As Marinda said, my name's Joshua Pether, and my mob are Kalkadoon, so that's far north Queensland in Mount Isa. And I'm living currently on Noongar country, which is in Western Australia, Perth. And what I do is principally, I consider myself, experimental performance artist. So I work mainly with experimental forms, but I have a background in dance and choreography as well. And currently I'm sitting in my lounge room and talking to a computer screen. And so I've been doing that for the past few days actually, which has been interesting.
So Josh, can you, you have a really interesting practice that you've alluded to as an experimental performance artist. Can you go into a little bit more detail now and describe your practice for us?
Yeah. My practice has sort of evolved from, like, it's, as I mentioned before, like I studied dance, and I've studied dance through places like ACPA, which is the Aboriginal Centre of Performing Arts, and also WAPA. So I did a year at WAPA as part of this sort of thing called LINK, which is like a postgraduate course that happens. And it's evolved from that through often, I suppose in many ways, like when I was, before I even sort of did dance as a sort of thing that I wanted to explore, I was mainly a visual artist, or that's what I would sort of consider where most of my artistic sort of interest lied. And so it's evolved from that, and also just collaborations with different sorts of artists other than dancers or choreographers. And then obviously over time, it's sort of evolved into sort of really interesting sort of combination that I now see as, performance art. Another thing that I've been interested in the last few years as well is the ritual making and what that means in a contemporary sense. And so I've started collaborating with artists that work through ritual, and that's a lot with people that have that knowledge, and also people that are sort of gaining that knowledge through their practice as well. And so, it's an interesting sort of I suppose melting pot that I have in terms of my practice. And I also have I work in health as well. I'm a pharmacist and I have been for many years. And so I might consider that as part of my practice, but it's sort of this thing of it's almost like two different worlds, and I'm sort of straddling. But now, because of this whole situation that's unfolding, I've had to actually force myself to actually see both those sort of career choices, I suppose, as part of the practice, as a holistic part of the practice. Yeah.
And so, Josh, I want to ask you to kind of unpack a little bit more the sort of interface in your practice between health and arts. But before we do so, I was wondering if you don't mind just giving us some more information about how you identify as an artist with a disability as well.
Yeah. I've for many years now have identified as having a disability, and I think that came mainly through I had an operation on my back way back when I was about 15 that sort of prevented me from sort of entering into a regular dance sort of career. So I had to think a bit outside the box in terms of what I'd be able to offer if I was a dancer. And so that in a way, because disability is sort of really a social based issue as opposed to to do with the body. And it was very clear to me that this was really a social based issue, because in terms of my other practice that I have, which is pharmacy, having a back that didn't bend wasn't an issue, whereas with dance or things that required movement, that became an issue. And so, I think, over the years, I've started to have more and more revelations, if you wish, in terms of what disability is for me. And it's also come about as a result of underlying, I suppose, health conditions, and also, I suppose, underlying perspectives and reality as well, which has been a really long part of my life as far as I can remember. I think disability has really informed my practice as well, in terms of, I suppose, how I also relate to the collaborators, and also how I relate to an audience as well.
Yeah, so like you said, it's kind of this melting pot of all these different facets of life. And so with that in mind, and the many kind of iterations of you as an experimental performance artist, how do you work then as a pharmacist right now on the front line of healthcare during COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the conversations that I started to have when I was doing a residency back with Critical Path in 2016, and how I was given the provocation about, I almost felt like I was living two different lives. And at the time it was sort of that, I was sort of seeing pharmacy as this one side of my life, and then arts practice as a separate side of it altogether. And so I almost like, and with arts practice, it didn't often happen in Perth. It happened over East, or it happened elsewhere. So it often would travel to and from places to do my arts practice, and then sort of base a lot of my pharmacy work here in Perth, because that's obviously where I live. And then one time, the facilitator that was part of that discussion and residency, Julie Volken, actually gave me the provocation about how I can actually consider both of those types, both of those sort of lifestyles or practices that you've chosen as part of your actual holistic practice. And so in a way, I try to do that where I work, but sometimes because of the way that some places operate, it is hard. It's hard. Like I'm a pharmacist that I try not to always sell you something. I always try to give information as much as possible, and depending on where you work, that's sometimes seen as a good thing, but sometimes because also we've come at a point where as a business we need to make a living as well. And so it's an interesting conundrum that I think health has sort of found itself in. And hopefully over this period of COVID-19, we'll start to assess what it is, what actually is the what's the priority that we have in terms of health. Because over the years, I'm seeing more and more that often, and it's not saying, and it's not in a bad way, but it sort of feels that it's being pushed towards a financial gain as opposed to like the health of people, which has been really sad. Because I think when I first started, it was sort of, that's the reason why I sort of went in to that sort of side of work. But then I've sort of seen it over time, and I think it's a lot to do with government sort of regulations and sort of reduction in funding in this area as well. And so now it seems that we're sort of trying to build up a business based on the idea that we're trying to sell you health or that sort of thing. And I know some people will disagree with that, but that's sort of where I see it from my perspective. So I found the challenges between the two sort of areas to be quite real. And so how I was able to navigate the two, and still today, how I'm able to navigate the two. And I'm hoping with this sort of change situation, we're going to find more and more and I think it is happening a lot, like it seems like the message is coming loud and clear from the health sector that we need to actually put people's healths above an economic sort of financial gain in many ways, which I think is sort of hard for a lot of people to understand because of the way that the whole system's been running for a long period of time. Yeah.
And so Josh, is that how you see a new sort of direction unfolding where artists can bring something to the health sector?
Yeah, I do. I think over time, hopefully, and I think I can speak more in relation to pharmacy than other industries. Like I think pharmacy assistants, particularly as this sort of crisis evolves, will be on the front line as well as the pharmacists themselves. And obviously, you can't really do pharmacy. You can't be a pharmacist, but I think arts workers can actually start to look at pharmacy assistant jobs, because in a way, like the health industry and also the food and production industry will be like a viable industry in the foreseeable future. And so I think that we'll hopefully start to see a lot more people that wouldn't necessarily consider a job in a pharmacy as part of, not a career, but as part of an income source. And I think, you know, once we start to get different levels of people into an industry, you start to change that industry and potentially infect that industry. And so one of the provocations I have, which is sort of like what I had to begin, which I sort of gave for myself, is how do you see, you know, something that potentially is not something that you wanted to do, but in a way you've been forced to sort of look at this sort of different income stream or different ways to make an income. How do you that also see as part of your practice, and how do you still continue, you know, practicing as an artist in this sort of environment where, you know, you are sort of limited to what you can do creatively in sort of like the confines of your house as such. But also, like, I think one of the benefits of artists working in the health industry is that it's very people orientated. And so we have a lot of access. We, as artists, we often, you know, have, we deal a lot with people and, you know, people's experiences. And so I think having the ability to be in an industry where you're always at the forefront of serving the community then allows, I think, more of the community to sort of understand, I suppose, arts as well. And so, yeah, like, I think there's lots of benefits in this sort of situation we find ourselves, where we could potentially be looking at different income streams and you know, as well as having a Zoom meeting for an hour or 2 hours in regards to arts practice, and then going to work, you know, in our own cities without having to stop, you know, a period of time, which is what I've been doing, is like stop, you know, have X amount of work in, you know, a few weeks, and then after that I have to devote that time to when I have to go over East, for instance. Whereas now it's sort of like I can have a meeting in the morning for 2 hours and then go off and do pharmacy. So we've got this situation where you can have like multiple income streams as a result of all this. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really fascinating conversation, and certainly, like, one of the things that we've been chatting through is this notion that, you know, when we were talking about wartime effort and, you know, is there going to be a point at which artists are called upon to sort of have a go in the trenches, and, you know, how do we go about that? But for now, you know, I'm actually going to call on anyone online who wants to ask Josh a question, because we're already out of time.
Out of time. Wow.
I guess so. Maybe while we're waiting for some questions to come through, I think the best way is to send them through on the online chat. I guess while we're waiting for some questions, Josh, on maybe a more positive note, you know, for a long time, people in our community have been saying the future is Indigenous, and, you know, just maybe want to provoke us to think about, in this moment that we see ourselves as a society in, is there an opportunity here to create the kind of future that we all want to live in? And, you know, what does that mean in regards to digital sovereignty, or, you know, this notion that the future is Indigenous?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the challenges we have, and I think it's a challenge that I think I face, is I suppose navigating this world where technology is going to be, in many ways, a way that we can make our bread and butter or connect to other organisations. But also there's an advantage in that, which I sort of alluded to, is that we can start to connect with all sorts of different places within a period of, like, you know, 24 hours, for instance. Like, we can start to connect with our local community with a Zoom meeting at, you know, 9 a.m. and then potentially someone in New York at midday or whatever. And then, so you have like the potential to sort of develop, these sort of different income streams if that's the way that this is sort of going, that your time and your sort of contribution to that chat sort of is a way that you can be remunerated for that in some way. And so, yeah, like I feel like in many ways, if we start to build on those relationships that through this digital platform, that when this is all over, that relationship has been a stepping point to like a more like working relationship as such. And I suppose it's different for mob everywhere. Like I've heard that some mob like that sort of face-to-face contact, and that's sort of how they establish relationships. But I suppose in this situation, we're sort of forced in a way to actually negotiate or navigate how we establish relationships, and sort of through this digital platform, which in many ways can be a strange reality for some, because it, as I sort of mentioned to Merinda, like the reality I find in terms of the way my work is sort of presented on a digital platform is quite different to when you watch it live. And so sometimes when you're communicating with people, it's sort of like this sort of false reality that you have in terms of a digital platform, as opposed to the experience of having that person in the room. So yeah, like I think the future is really, even though it seems quite bleak at this point, there's a lot of opportunity to actually take on board a lot of these provocations about like, how we're able to look at different income streams from, from the point of where we are now, and also how we've got this advantage now to actually develop these really rich relationships over a period of months and months and months, which sometimes when you're working with companies, like I'll just take my example, like with Performance Space and a lot of engagement I have there, in some ways, the relationship's been quite sort of not as long as I'd like, but over periods of times it has. But the initial relationship was very fast and quick. Whereas now I think that if you wanted to work with an international organisation or a place overseas, you have that ability to actually talk in a more, like, I suppose, more fruitful and sort of meaningful way as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that for a long time we've been hearing from performing arts centres and venues, particularly around this notion of national touring, that the fly-in, fly-out model is broken, and people want deeper, longer, richer engagement. So I guess what I'm kind of picking up on what you're saying, Josh, is that with more time to talk things through and build more relationships, there's an opportunity for a new, deeper, richer, longer term relationship with COVID-19, in terms of things that are possibly positive, which we have to look for in this time of crisis. There's a question here from Gareth.
Yeah.
So Norm, do we go to Gareth to ask the question, or do I read it out? Go to Gareth. Okay, Gareth, if you don't mind reading out your question for Josh.
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. Zooming in from Wurundjeri country. My question is I've just been interested, Josh, in hearing about your relationship with ritual, and I was thinking a lot about how we're all having to develop these new rituals in these offices that we're all now working in. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on the relationship between sort of domestic ritual versus ritual, and then of course you can't talk about ritual if we don't talk about secular rituals. So
Yeah.
have an observation.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because a lot of my work in terms of ritual comes from a personal perspective. And so, and also some of the collaborators I work with, their perspective of ritual comes from like a very sort of deep cultural perspective as well. And so they've got a lot of a lot of things in trying to navigate in this contemporary world in terms of their cultural sort of knowledge of what ritual is. And so when I work a lot with these collaborators, we often use, like we often see ritual as sort of like an everyday occurrence. And so depending on how I suppose you see it, it can sort of be as simple. This whole ritual of washing our hands every day has become like a common thing for everybody. And so, like I think in many ways, like ritual is going to be it will become a part of our life in a way, like particularly with this sort of thing that we're having to do in terms of hygiene as well, and sort of keeping in mind like the fact that, you know, we have to consider ourselves almost contaminated in a way. And so this constant sort of ritual of cleansing and sort of thing will become part of our sort of, I think in many ways, like after all this is done, will actually become part of a cultural sort of change that will happen throughout the Western society. And so that's another thing that I think, you know, more people will be exposed to this idea of ritual, because it's sort of this thing that's a practice that's done every day, or in a sense it's done in a cultural sense as well. And I think one of the things that I think as a ritual maker we might will be challenging is to actually how you do that for a digital platform. Because often with ritual, it's not necessarily the visual element of what you're seeing, it's more in relation to the visceral element. And so one of the things that's missing through this whole conversation is the connection that we have as a community in terms of like when we're together, and the sort of that sort of connection sort of being almost like this energy that is created. And then that's the energy that often is the power in which the ritual sort of unfolds. And so now we're finding, because we're not connected physically, how do you also have that power to still be present in this digital realm? And one of the exercises I was thinking of doing before we sort of just decided on a Q&A was, I don't know if anyone's done it, I know some dancers would have done it, is the exercise where we all sort of go around in a circle, and then as we sort of sense, you know, the connection in the room, we all move forward at the same time. And so how do we do that in a digital, like I wanted to see if that would actually work in this digital realm. Like if we all had our computers and we all stood still and we all sort of concentrated wherever we are, will we be able to still achieve that same sort of exercise? Because in many ways, that's a real powerful element if we're able to sort of break away from that sort of false digital reality that we're in, to then sort of have that feeling of connectiveness in such a remote and digital environment. Yeah.
So there's some really, really interesting questions coming through about the time to decolonize and what does digital sovereignty mean. But unfortunately, we're not going to have time to explore them all today. But I think that definitely there's an appetite here for further conversations on this topic. And I just wanted to do something a little bit unscheduled in closing, if that's okay. I've noticed that we've been graced by the presence of a wonderful elder in our community here in Brisbane. And I was just wondering if Uncle Richard Bell might like to offer some closing comments on today's topic and conversation.
Jesus, well, I joined in a bit late. Well, I did have a question. It was, what the fuck is digital sovereignty? You know, so I've been Googling for the last 15 minutes what it is. So I've got an idea what it is. Yeah, we've been talking about this shit. And just white people keep giving names to every fucking thing. You're like, I'm just trying to keep up with, with all that's been said about this coronavirus. So I've been making a lot of visits to Google and Snopes, like fact checking everything. So I was so involved in my research. I'm sorry, I missed a lot of the discussion.
I think though everyone's asking the same thing. What is digital sovereignty? And in fact, I think that up next on the list of Zooms you can join today is the Australia Council's First Nations Roundtable. And I think they're going to be talking about or putting a provocation out to the sector about starting a think tank around the future is Indigenous and how do we have sovereignty in this space, and exploring and unpacking this notion of digital sovereignty. I don't want to say too much more. It's a conversation that's definitely starting. So Norm, Josh, have we sort of completed the brief? Are we?
Yeah, look, okay. Thank you very much, Merinda and Josh and Richard and others who've helped bring this start. Our sense is probably start this topic and list a whole stack of stuff that we as a sector through this forum and others need to start to think about and unpack. I really love the idea of Josh's that we've got this asset now of time together to build relationships and have the kind of depth of work and conversation that we can't do in ordinary practice unless you're kind of really working closely with the company. And so I think that's a really great observation that's going to help us, make the most of our time together and to think through what things might be useful and interesting. We've got one quick update about next week's lunches that we want to share. We've been talking to the Australia Council, and because Monday is the day that the 4-year funding results come out, we didn't want to host a conversation in the middle of the day when some companies have probably got a response from the Australia Council in the morning and others might not be hearing to the afternoon. It felt not right to us to be trying to have a conversation, and it's obviously going to be such a big issue for the sector on Monday. So our suggestion is to cancel Monday, not have not having a lunch on Monday. We come back on Tuesday to Friday again next week, and the Australia Council wants to come and be part of the conversation in a formal way again on Friday. So Frank Panucci is going to come on, and so there'll be a bit of time for everyone to kind of digest what the results of the 4-year funding thing mean, formulate some questions, and we can have a conversation then as a group with the Australia Council about what that means. And obviously in those lunches beforehand, it can be part of the topic there. We're just in the process of formulating the programs for those next series of lunches. So please use email or whatever to suggest stuff. And now just want to pass as we're one last little update that we want to invite Anne Dunn to come on and let us know about an idea that she's starting to work on as well, just to kind of seed it in our heads and sort of get a bit of a sense of whether we think this is going to be a useful thing. So are you there, Anne?
I'm here, Norm.
Great.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm on Kaurna land. Norm and Sarah and I have been trying to think about what are the practical ways we could connect people so that artists get the support they need. And so I was a bit moved the other day when Katrina was talking about there are people who can't even get online, have no online access. So we're starting to play with an idea of inviting artists to register on ArtsFront with just a bit of information about themselves, saying that they would appreciate some online support, and then asking people around the country to purchase 6 months worth of online support for an artist. Mm-hmm. So basically trying to have a system that's pretty simple, that doesn't need any administration, that where we just connect people who are prepared to be donors with artists who would want that support. When I had a quick look, I mean, it looks like you can get about 30 gigs for $30 or 35 gigs for $35 on a mobile phone, and 50 gigs if you want data only on a toggle or a handheld Wi-Fi. I mean, I think we'd need to make the package look pretty simple. So saying to people, would you pay, I mean, people pay $30, $1 a day, basically, to support kids growing up overseas. So I'm thinking we could say, would you pay $30 a month for the next 6 months to give an artist access to the internet so that they can be connected in communities and explore their practice and whatever else. And I mean, all artists, I don't just mean visual artists, I mean everybody, or even arts workers, techs, and those people who want to stay in the artistic community. So I'm wondering whether you think that this is a useful thing to do, or are there things that are higher priority that we would be asking individuals to donate to? Do you think we could make this work? Do you think having mobile phone access is useful, or do you think we really need to be looking at NBN data? So we're just really looking for advice from you to see whether it's an idea worth pursuing. Thanks, Norm.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne. And now, to start with, if you've got immediate thoughts, put them in the chat window so it'll be captured there. We'll bring it up again on Tuesday with the possibility of starting a kind of a spin-off group that wants to be involved in a direct way in this as an action. So we're really feeling our way with that stuff, but it feels like that there's a lot of potential for us to do stuff together and help to mobilize to things like that. And if other people have got other ideas, other actions that you'd like to put forward and take a lead on, then we want to try and support those as well. So it's just the start of that work together. So again, thank you very much to particularly Merinda and Josh and Susan for the signing again today, and the wonderful Melissa Robinson, who's typing her fingers off up in Babinda.